Good morning. Can you tell us your name and where you're from?
My name is Alice Taub. Taub is my married name. And I was born in Miskolc, Hungary. And when I was about a year and a half, we moved to Antwerp, Belgium, where my mother, my father, and I lived until World War II in 1940.
And your family name?
My family name is Nagy, N-A-G-Y. It's my maiden name.
Could you tell us about growing up in Belgium?
Well, Belgium was, Antwerp is where we lived in Belgium. And Antwerp was a very lovely city. Before the 1940 war, it had approximately a population of about close to 50,000 Jews. Very nice Jewish community, a Jewish theater, a lot of Jewish intellectual amenities, and it was a wonderful place to live. I attended, we had 2 day schools, and I attended one of the day schools named Tarkemoni in Antwerp at the time. And in May of 1940, the war broke out and the Germans invaded Belgium. And we tried to get away from Belgium. Actually, the thing was that we have had papers to come to the United States, but for one reason or another, my uncle and my parents kept lingering and lingering and lingering, and finally the war broke out, and we still were in Belgium. And so when the war broke out and we started getting bombarded, the first day my mother and my father and my uncle and my aunts got together, and they decided that this was still the first day of the war. They decided that we should try to embark ourselves on a train toward the southern part of France, which was, as the Germans were advancing, they weren't there yet. They were in the northern part of France. And with such plan as to reach the southern part of France, the port of Bayonne or Biarritz, where we could possibly catch a boat to come out to the United States. Well, best laid plans of men and mice. The war was going on and the Germans kept bombing, which meant that the trains were going 2 miles forward, 1 mile backwards, and by the time we arrived in the southern part of France, in Bayonne or Biarritz, the Germans had preceded us. We arrived at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they had preceded us. They arrived at midnight and shut down all the seaport. And there was, I remember, because it was about 9 and a half, I remember there was a debacle that even as a child, it was something fierce to see. I mean, people were, suddenly it was like they realized they were caught. They were caught in an impasse, in such an impasse, a matter of life and death impasse. And people were so discouraged and so taken aback that you could see suitcases everywhere. They didn't even care about their belongings anymore. All they were trying to do is, we had heard a lot about Hitler and what they were doing to the Jews, because prior to 1940, when the war broke out, we have had German Jews coming, trying to escape Hitler's path and coming over through Belgium. So we have heard what was happening in Germany. We didn't know about concentration camps, of course. Nobody knew about those till afterwards. But we have heard how the Jews were persecuted in Germany, so forth. So we knew what was ahead of us when we got caught in France. So everybody was trying to make some sort of an arrangements in order to survive in whatever plot we were in. And it was advised that we should go into smaller towns and cities. Since we were at that time in the southern part of France, a bunch of us were put on a bus to go to a small, I would say it was a village at the time, near Pau in France, which is not far from the Spanish border. In Pau, in the little town was called Abos, and we were put in there, and we arrived sometime around midnight or so, and very strange, because this was a farmer's, it was a little village, it was a farmer's town, and usually you would find the farmers asleep by that time, but they were all there. They wanted to see what Jews looked like. They were told that a bunch of Jews were coming, and they wanted to see what Jews looked like, because this was a small town. They had never seen any Jews. They always were told by all sorts of stories. Jews had long noses and horns and were this, and they had killed Jesus Christ, and who knows what kind of things they looked like. So the whole town had gathered. I remember as a child debarking the bus, and we were worn out after all our experiences. We were hungry and dirty and everything. And these people came to see what Jews looked like. And after they had viewed us for about an hour or two, the comment was, but these people look like we do. I mean, they look the same as we do. And anyway, we were dispersed among smaller families, you know, here and there. And my mother happened to be put with a French family, farmer family. And we were there, and we were trying to make a stable environment, I guess, as we could. In between time, I forgot to say, my father was killed in the bombardment while we were trying to escape. You know, where we were trying to reach Bayonne. The trains were being bombarded, and he had gotten down to get something. I forget what it was, coffee, tea, whatever, and he got killed. Of course, all these traumas added to the fact, you know, that we arrived in this village, and it was really hard. It was hard for my mother and for the older people, because they didn't speak French. We, as young children, my cousins were a little younger. I was probably the older ones. We, as children, particularly myself, in Belgium, it's a very small country bordered by many other different countries, and you learn to speak languages at an early age. First of all, they have two national languages, French and Flemish, which means that as you enter school, you start learning both languages. And then in the 4th or 5th grade, I forget which one, you were added an English language, and by the time you reach the 8th or 9th grade, you have the choice between Spanish and German and whatever is available. And so by the time you graduate from high school, you have 4 languages. And the funny part of it is, when I say 4 languages to somebody here, they say, oh yeah, I took French in high school. And they can hardly say a word in French. But this isn't the way we learned, because the language had to be used. It was a very small country, and the languages were used. So I was fortunate. I spoke French when we arrived in France. And it was fortunate for my family, because I was able to help with the translation until they learned. And believe me, under such circumstances, people learn very fast. We started going to school. Actually, I was the only one that was school age. I'm about 5 years older than my cousins. And so I was the only one who was school age at the time. And we started being absorbed by try to make life normal. And we started going to school, and the school was like a small town school where all the classes were together. 3 kids in this class, 2 kids in that class, and so forth. It was a one-room classroom, and all the children were together. And it was supervised by a, what would I say? It's a inspector, a regional inspector or whatever. And we stayed there for maybe a couple of years, and the regional inspector used to come by and observe the teachings. And I'll never forget, the teacher loved to call on me for some reason to show me off or whatever. And I had to recite a poem by Lamartine, and it was a very nostalgic poem. And I don't know what got into me, a touch of nostalgia or whatever. And I recited the poem with, I guess, with a lot of feeling. And the inspector said, "Oh," she said, this girl is going to be a poet someday." Little did he know that I'm not so good in literature or so forth. Anyway, that was that. From there, my mother and I were put in had to be moved because the Germans acted on nationalities. For instance, a French or a German were German Jews were anti-Germans, and they were hauled away immediately. Some of the others, which they considered more allies, which Hungarians seemed like Hungary was more like an allied country, and we had sort of reprieves, and they put us in a very small town up about 5 or 6 kilometers from the Spanish border called Aubonne. Aubonne before World War II was a beautiful resort area with gorgeous hotels, ski slopes, and so forth. But of course, during World War II, it was shut down, and the hotels had been made available for the refugees. And they were magnificent. I mean, you came in and you practically fell into the carpet. But what it was, since it was a resort town, there were no farmers and there was no food. There was absolutely no food to be had. Everything was on rations. You had ration cards, and you had bread rations and so forth. And that was it. If you run out of your rations, that was the end of your bread. So there was a baker in town, and he loved to drink. So you also had wine rations. And we didn't drink any wine, my mother and I. So we used to take our wine rations to the baker. And many people did the same thing, because he had one thing. When he was drunk, not that, God forbid, we didn't want to pay him the money, but he forgot to take the ration coupons for bread, which was a great deed, which means you doubled up almost in your bread rations, you know, at the time. So we saw to it that he was drunk a lot, you know, the baker. And from Aubonne, then we were taken backwards towards the central part of France, in an area about 100 kilometers from Limoges, also a small area, which was to the great fortune of my mother. My mother and her 2 sisters, we were put in a place which had exactly 3 houses and was not exactly in the path of the Nazi army. It was not worthwhile for them to bother with a small village which had 3 or 4 houses. But there was still a Jewish committee that was active in doing some things, and they felt that the children would need some education, and this was not the place to get a decent education. The school was about 7.5 kilometers to walk, and the farmers, they were used to it. That was fine, but you know, 7 kilometers going, 7.5 kilometers coming was a long distance to walk to school. So they decided that, they told my mother that it would be easier to hide a child, especially a child who already spoke fluently French and could be very well assimilated as a French-born child. And with false papers, I was taken, and on our way to a school, a pensionnat. What happened was I fell from a bicycle the night before, and I injured myself badly, and I would have to be taken care of before I was going. So they had already made arrangements to take me. So I was taken away, and in the intermediate, before I was put into the pension, I went to a convent in Limoges, and nobody knew that I was Jewish except for the Mother Superior in that convent. And I had to stay there because, frankly, I wasn't able to walk very well. I had a great big injury, and my leg was completely stiff. And I was in that convent for maybe 6-7 months. And some funny things happened there. I happened to have had a good voice while I was a youngster. And I joined the choir. And this was toward the fall. And when I joined the choir, they distinguished my voice even better. And I was chosen among the orphans to sing Ave Maria on Christmas Eve. And I'll never forget that Christmas Eve as long as I live, because I was trained to sing, and I came forth and I sang, and the tears were just rolling down my eyes. And they thought, oh, it was so lovely. She sang the Ave Maria with such a feeling, you know. It was just beautiful. Little did they know, while the tears were rolling down my eyes. But that was over, and my leg felt better. And I was put in a pensionnat near between Limoges and La Tour, which is, to tell you the truth, I forget the name of that place. And I corresponded with my mother, and I couldn't really correspond with her openly because, according to my papers, I was an orphan. I was an orphan from the northern part of France, whose parents were killed during a bombardment, according to my false papers. And I corresponded. She wrote to me with Hungarian words. And I understood a few words of Hungarian prior to that, but I didn't know the language. But I soon learned to answer her questions in a different language, and I wrote to her as Madame such and such, because she wasn't supposed to be my mother. And so with the wartime correspondence, we were able to at least keep in touch of where I was and where she was. And this, the pensionnat went about, I don't know how long, for a little while. And that was the time when the German army was beginning to have some defeats. And they were beginning to withdraw. This was towards the end already. And to my luck, they were withdrawing in our area, which meant that the pensionnat, started being disbanded, and everybody had a place to go home, because these were children from local farm places. But I didn't have a place. I didn't have a place to go anywhere. And so they put me in a farm not far away from there. And to my luck, this happened to be the farm where the FFE, which was the French Resistance Army, had its headquarters and had just left about a few days ago. And these places were having such repercussions that a few days prior to it, a similar place, had the Germans had come and had found that out and then burned the farm with the people inside it. So it was lovely, lovely, from the fire into the oven. So when I arrived there, they didn't dare to sleep. Nobody dared to sleep in their house at night, because they were afraid that if the Germans came back and they found out something that they would do the same to this. So there was a great big ditch about a little further away in the field, and they put a tarpaulin into the ditch, and we all lay down in the ditch, and then the men laid some tarpaulin over us with some wigs and twigs and all that stuff in order to hide us, to make sure that nobody would know where we were sleeping. And I stayed there for a period of a little while, till we heard that the Germans had passed that area already, and then people were trying to get together. There was no more at that time. It was bad. There was no more transportation. Trains were going unscheduled. One yes, one no. I didn't know how to get. The mail wasn't going around. I didn't know how to get back to my mother. And in between time, also an incident. In between time, while I was in the pensionat, they were having vacations, and as I said, during vacations, all the other children would go home to their parents. I had no place to go. According to my papers, I was an orphan. So I was put in a, what is that called? A youth hostel in Limoges during the German occupation. And Limoges is a lovely city, and at a certain place not far from the youth hostel was a round kiosk like that with several exits into some streets, and not having anything to do. And on an afternoon, I went into the movies, to see something. Well, at the outcome of the movies, toward the end, the Germans, toward 43, they were even worse than they had ever been before. Somehow they felt like things were not going as well for them, and the time was beginning to be limited, and they were worse than they were ever before. And they were picking up people all over. You saw them arresting people and beating people in the street as they picked them up. And as I was in the movies, when we were coming out, the exit was maybe the width of this table, and there were 4 SS standing there asking for identification cards. Well, I was a tall child, but I didn't have an identification card because I didn't need one. You didn't need an identification card until you were 14 years old or 15 years old, and I hadn't reached that age yet. But I was tall. I looked like I was at least 14, 15. And I said to myself, well, say goodbye to life. This is it, This is the no escape part. And as I was approaching there, I had a raincoat with pockets in the inside, like a men's, trench coat. And I don't know what got into me, why. I didn't have anything in that pocket, but for some reason, I put my hand in there, and the Germans thought that I was putting back some papers. And he shoved me out and said, "Machen Sie schon schnell!" And he threw me up. And at that moment, I don't know, at that moment I had a feeling like the good Lord was trying to tell me something, that I was meant to survive. I don't know, something entered into me, and I knew that I was meant to survive. And it made me feel strong. It made me want to fight and to pull in everything I had, because I don't know, it was a strange feeling. It was a strange feeling, but at that moment I knew I was meant to survive. And during the time that we were at the pensionnat, the last rate, for some reason there were 2 Jewish girls there. And it was strange how we identified each other. Nobody had told one another. We weren't able to tell each other that you were Jewish and you're not Jewish. But somehow we had recognized each other. And we decided we have to do something. After all, we are different. We have a Friday night, a Shabbos, and a Shabbos going. What are we going to do that would be different for us? So everything was rationed, even chocolate. Chocolate bars were rationed. We got 4 chocolate bars a month. They were tiny little chocolate bars We got 4 per month. And we decided that we couldn't do anything else without being obvious. We decided that Friday night, you know, to mark the onsetting of the Shabbat, to make sure that we remember that Shabbos is Shabbos, we were going to eat 1 candy bar. That was our note of making sure that Shabbos was here. And unfortunately, prior to the closing of the pensionnat, 2 of the girls were supposedly going to Switzerland. They were supposedly being smuggled into Switzerland or somehow. And I later learned that the train had been caught by the Nazis, and I guess they were all had sent to Auschwitz. And I was supposed to be on that train, but I caught a very, very nasty temperature. I was unconscious with temperature. And again, I was left off the train. And again, I knew, for some reason, I knew this was my mark. I was meant to survive. It was God's will that I will survive. I was marked to survive. I don't know, something was in me that I knew I was meant to survive. And as the things ended, you know, toward the end, as I said, I was in the farmhouse and I had to work with the farmers, but at least there was food. There was food to be had. Where there was a farm, you had one advantage. You may not have had many luxuries, but you had the greatest luxury of life. You had life by food. And so I was able, by helping the farmers with some of and help was very rare because all the young men were either in the French resistance or were prisoners in German camps and so forth. So help was rare, and they welcomed any kind of help. Machinery they didn't have. Gasoline was rationed. They couldn't work any of their automatic machinery. So help was very welcome. So if you wanted to work with them, you know, at least you had food. It was a matter of survival. And since this particular farm was on a bit of an elevation, we saw far away. And some days we could see, and some nights we could see Châteauroux being bombed constantly by airplanes and so forth. So we knew what was going on in the world, but we were kind of shut off. But in a way, there was always an underground news, and you knew what was going on. And as well as the end of the war came, I became more conscious of having to make an effort of trying to see how I could reach my mother. And as I said, the trains weren't going at the time anymore because everything was shut down. So I found a truck driver, and several people got together, and the truck driver was taking us from where I was in the farm up to Limoges, which was about another 100 kilometers from where my mother was hiding. And I didn't know these people from Adam, but in a time like that, you don't think that you have to have a formal introduction to go with somebody. You just go. So we went with the truck driver, and it was very hard because he had to make several stops to find gasoline here and there. It was the longest trip. That trip should normally take maybe a couple of hours. It took us 2 days to get to Limoges. But it was, in one way, it was wonderful because everybody was pulling together. If one had a piece of bread, they shared it with everybody else. If one had this, you shared it with everybody. It was something so wonderful at that time, you know. Even when you were able to catch a train, and you sat into a train, and the train, you could hardly see it because people were standing, sitting, crouching, whatever you could. The trains were so full if you could catch one. If somebody had something, or if a farmer came in with a basket of food to eat, well, you knew he was going to share with everybody. There was a party going on, and so you had food. That was a kind of an atmosphere that was going on. And to make a story shorter, I was able to get back to my mother by hitchhiking here and there. And so I was reunited with my mother at the time. But that wasn't the end of, I mean, it wasn't the end yet. At the time, we stayed in that little farmhouse for a little while until the Jewish community services were organizing. And they asked us to come, they asked my mother to send me back to Limoges. And this time it was already under Jewish official organization. It was the end of war. And they made a pensionnat, one for girls and one for boys. And we were put into schools, and I went to Lycée de Jeunes Filles in Limoges at the time, but then my mother knew already and could correspond officially with me, And in a nutshell, that's what happened to me during World War II. And in 1946, we came back to Belgium, my mother and I. By that time, we were alone. We had on the way lost contact with my uncles and aunts and so forth. But we all knew that everybody was going to come back to Antwerp. And so we, as soon as it was possible, we headed back to Antwerp, and my mother and I came back to Antwerp in 1946. And at that time, my uncle and my aunt had preceded us, and they were already in Antwerp. And that's in short my story. So if you have any special questions, I'll be glad to answer you.
Did you find out about your mother's experience?
Yes, my mother passed away. I don't know if you remember my mother, Mrs. Stern was her name. My mother passed away about 3 years ago. And yes, her experience was, and I might as well say this because you won't have an opportunity to interview her. Her experiences were in all the places where we had stayed, in all the small French villages. Her experience were that she was a wonderful housewife in every facet, in cooking, in baking, in knitting, and in everything. And I can really say that saved her life, because as I explained to you, help was of an optima in farms at the time, and anybody who was willing to do anything, like for instance, the farmers were spinning their own wool from their lambs and the sheep, but they didn't have the time to knit. So if my mother would knit for them warm socks or warm gloves or warm sweaters, that was good for maybe a couple of weeks of food or something on that order. Or they loved the very thin vermicelle, the noodles in soup, but they didn't have time to make these things. And if my mother would make a bunch of that, which could be dried for them, that was good for maybe another 2-3 weeks of food. And I can say that my mother survived in all the small places through her own wits, through her own crafts, and through her own wits. She was never a lazy person. She was a very active person all her life. And by finding out what suited for the occasion, she was able to survive that way. She was able to at least, if not fancy clothes, but at least she was able to put food in her mouth in order to survive and have the bare necessities in order to survive.
Oh.
That's shortly.
What about her sisters?
Her sisters were about in the same path. Of course, I had lost one of my uncles during World War II. One of my uncle, because he was born in Czechoslovakia, was put in a what they called local concentration camps. They were not as bad as Auschwitz was, because there was not local extermination being done, but they were pretty bad in every other aspect. And my uncle was put in Camp de Gurs which was in a southern part of France area. And he had it kind of rough. And she did too. And in between time, she was pregnant with my cousin, who was born in 1943. And because of that pregnancy, he was released from the camp. And so you can say that my cousin can really say he saved his father's life, because they emptied the Camp de Girls toward the end of 1943, and they deported almost everybody to Auschwitz. So in a way, you can say that he saved his father's life, you know. My aunts did the same thing as my mother. They survived by their wits. They weren't professional women. They didn't have any profession to offer, and it wouldn't have done them any good. The same as even money would not have done them any good, because the farmers wouldn't take money for their foods. They couldn't do anything with money. There was nothing to buy. You couldn't buy gasoline, or you couldn't buy things because they weren't available. What would they have done with money? But if somebody offered them help like that, it was worthwhile for them to give food for that. And what did you need? You didn't need anything else at the time to survive. So that's it.
What do you recall about your dad, your father? It was just, you were the only child, right?
I was an only child, yes. Not overly much as the years go by, because my mother was the main figure in our household. She was the one who was the teacher, the this and that. So, and you know, I really don't recall that much about my father. He took us out on the weekends, on Shabbos. He took us out. We went walk. We have a very beautiful park in Antwerp where there are many swans on the lake, you know, and so forth. And I remember walking with my father and my mother before World War II on the Sabbath after services, taking nice walks in the park. And I remember we have a magnificent zoo with orchestra and everything in Antwerp. And I remember my father and my mother taking me to the zoo. And we have, it's a seaport. It's before World War II, it was the third largest seaport in Europe, Antwerp. So there's nice promenades around the quay, you know, the Embarcadero. There are nice promenades there. I remember going there. There were islands across where there were like beaches and so forth. So in the summertime, we used to go there on a Sunday. He used to pack a picnic and take us to St. Anneke, you know, which was across. There was an underground, a very interesting thing. We had like an inlet from the sea where the boats would come, and there was a tunnel dug underneath the inlet to an island, and you could hop into a car or a bus and drive all the way to the island, or you could take a ferry and go over to the island. But this existed before World War II. You know, it was an interesting place. Antwerp is a very interesting city. It was a lovely town. But coming back was rather sad, because out of the 50,000 Jews, 50,000 plus or minus Jews that had lived in Antwerp before World War II, and that had provided for such a varied and rich culture to that city. As I said, we had a Yiddish theater, we had, you know, many cultural events, we had strong organizations at the time of all kinds, religious as well as non-religious organizations, because when there's 50,000 Jews together, you got a great variety of opinions, I'm sure, you understand. But out of those, after World War II, there were maybe original ones, maybe 4,500 left or so. And some of them, very few of them, had managed to go to the United States and to South America, but very few of them. But the city grew to about a 9,000 population, not necessarily from, the survivors of the Antwerp survivors, but it grew to a 9,000 population or so because all the other people returning who were from the eastern countries had been able to get out, with all of this, and were coming to live to Antwerp. They didn't want to be under communist domination and so forth. They didn't want to go back. A lot of them never wanted to go back to the places they had been from after all they had suffered, and they came to Antwerp. It was also a stopover place because boats were going from Antwerp to the United States. So it was over like a stopover station, and that's about it. Still today, they have about 9,500 to 10,000 Jews in Antwerp, but it's not the same. It's not the same type of a city. Today, Antwerp is I understand, I haven't been there since 1971, but I understand today Antwerp is an extremely religious city, and since my mother didn't live there anymore, and my mother left in 1972, I have had no opportunity to go back to Antwerp. And since I don't have anybody there, I have no desire to go back anymore.
You lived there until 1953?
Well, we lived there. I came there when I was a year and a half old, which would be 1931, 32, and until 1940 when the war broke out. And we came back in 1946. And I met my husband to a friend of, I was befriended with a girl who was marrying a friend of my husband. And we met at their wedding. And we got married in 1953. And I had papers in the process to come to the United States, but my husband had already existing papers to come to the United States. So we were married on March the 8th of 1953, and his papers were expiring by March the 26th of March the 8th, yeah, by March the 26th of 1953, which meant that we had to be in the United States by that time. So we got married, and then 10 days later we came to the United States.
And you have 2 children?
Yes, I have 2 children and 2 grandchildren.
And what are their names?
My daughter is the oldest. Her name is Diane, and she's married and has a little girl of her own. And my son's name is Marvin, and he's married, and he has a little girl of his own today.
Thank you, Mrs. Taub.